2,000 spectators have gathered to witness the execution of America's most notorious criminal. The man standing on the gallows doesn't look like a killer. He's well-dressed, articulate, and has spent his final weeks teaching fellow inmates Latin and Greek. But as the noose tightens around his neck, Edward Howard Rulloff delivers the most bone-chilling last words in execution history. "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner." The crowd falls silent. This isn't the remorse of a broken man. It's the arrogant defiance of someone who believes he's superior to everyone around him, even in death. The executioner pulls the lever, and America's most intellectually gifted serial killer drops into eternity. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. Edward Rulloff possessed one of the largest human brains ever recorded. 1,673 centimeters of pure cognitive power. He spoke multiple languages, conducted groundbreaking research in linguistics, and could have been one of the greatest scholars of his generation. Instead, he used that massive brain to plan the perfect murders. Hours after his execution, surgeons carefully removed Rulloff's brain and discovered something that would haunt scientists for decades. This organ, larger than Einstein's, larger than nearly any brain on record, had housed the mind of a cold-blooded killer who murdered his own wife and infant daughter, then spent decades manipulating everyone around him. Judge Ransom Balcom had warned authorities years earlier, "This man understands his rights better than you do and will defend them to the last." He was right. Edward Rulloff's exceptional intelligence made him not a gift to humanity, but one of its most dangerous predators. In this video, we uncover the terrifying true story of the genius killer, a man whose brilliance became his most deadly weapon and whose preserved brain still sits in a jar at Cornell University. A haunting reminder that intelligence without conscience creates monsters. Edward Howard Rulloff entered the world around 1819 New Brunswick, Canada, and his parents were Danish immigrants. From his earliest years, Edward displayed an intellect that was nothing short of remarkable. Languages came to him effortlessly: Latin, Greek, German, each new tongue absorbed like a sponge soaking up water. But exceptional intelligence can be a double-edged sword. Without proper moral guidance, it can become something far more dangerous than ignorance. By his 20th birthday, he had already experienced both sides of the law, working at a law firm before serving 2 years in prison for embezzlement. Edward's first taste of criminal life taught him an important lesson. Society's rules applied to ordinary people, but perhaps not to someone of his exceptional intellect. In 1842, seeking new opportunities, Edward crossed into upstate New York and settled in the small town of Dryan. He presented himself as a schoolmaster, a respectable profession that provided perfect cover for his true interests. But Edward wasn't content with just teaching. He began studying botanical medicine under Dr. Henry Bull, acquiring knowledge of plants, herbs, and most importantly, poisons. Through Dr. Bull, Edward met one 7-year-old, Harriet Schutt, the doctor's cousin. The Schutt family took an immediate dislike to this mysterious stranger. There was something unsettling about Edward's charm. It felt calculated, artificial, like he was playing a role rather than expressing genuine emotion. Despite her family's strong objections, Harriet was captivated by Edward's intelligence and sophistication. In 1843, against all advice, she married him. The newlyweds moved to Lansing, New York, where Harriet gave birth to their daughter, Priscilla. For a brief moment, it seemed like domestic life might tame Edward's darker impulses, but normally was never something Edward Rulloff could embrace for long. As 1844 wore on, Edward's frustration with their modest circumstances grew increasingly apparent. He spoke obsessively about grander ambitions, becoming a university professor, writing revolutionary works on language and philosophy, achieving the recognition his brilliant mind deserved. He pressured Harriet constantly to move to Ohio, where he was convinced better opportunities awaited. But Harriet, now a young mother, refused to be far from her family, refused to uproot their lives again. This defiance triggered something dark and violent in Edward's psyche. How dare his intellectually inferior wife oppose his superior judgment? Neighbors began noticing troubling changes in the Rulloff household. Edward's charm seemed forced and brittle. Harriet appeared increasingly withdrawn, often sporting unexplained bruises. Baby Priscilla seemed perpetually ill and fussy. The breaking point came on the 22nd of June, 1844. Edward confronted Harriet one final time about moving to Ohio. When she refused again, he exploded in a rage, accusing her of having an affair with Dr. Bull. As Harriet worked in their kitchen, crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle, Edward's fury reached its peak. In one swift, violent motion, he grabbed the pestle from her hands and brought it down on her skull with devastating force. Harriet collapsed to the kitchen floor, blood pooling beneath her head. In that moment, Edward Rulloff crossed a line from which there could be no return. But instead of panic or remorse, his brilliant mind immediately shifted into analytical mode. He had a problem to solve, and his exceptional intelligence would help him solve it. 3-month-old Priscilla began crying in her crib, a witness who couldn't be reasoned with or intimidated. While Edward never explicitly confessed to killing the baby, he later admitted he gave her something to make her stop crying. The infant fell silent, and Edward was alone with 2 bodies and the need to craft the perfect cover-up. The morning after the murders, Edward Rulloff demonstrated the calculating intelligence that would define his entire criminal career. He approached his neighbors, the Andersons, with a seemingly innocent request. "Could you lend me your horse and wagon to return a wooden chest to my uncle?" The Andersons watched as Edward loaded both the chest and what appeared to be a heavy sack into their wagon. He told them he was heading east, but they observed him traveling toward Kaunga Lake in the completely opposite direction. Hours later, Edward returned. The chest was still in the wagon, but the mysterious sack had vanished. He appeared remarkably calm, almost cheerful, as he explained that he and Harriet would be traveling for a few weeks. For several days, Edward's performance was flawless. He continued teaching his classes, chatted normally with townspeople, and showed no signs of distress. His ability to compartmentalize was extraordinary. He could discuss philosophy and literature, while knowing that somewhere beneath Kaunga Lake's dark waters lay the body of his wife. But Harriet's family had heard nothing from their daughter since Edward's announcement of their supposed trip. When concerned relatives came to check on the couple, they found the house in complete disarray. All of Harriet's personal belongings were still there. Her clothes, her jewelry, items she would never have left behind voluntarily. When pressed for details about their departure, Edward's carefully constructed lies began to unravel. First, he claimed Harriet had abandoned him. Then he said they had moved to Ohio together. Each new explanation contradicted the last, and none of them made sense. Realizing his deception was falling apart, Edward made a desperate decision. He ran. But he had underestimated the determination of Harriet's family. Her brother Ephraim organized a relentless pursuit driven by love for his sister and an unshakable belief that Edward was responsible for her disappearance. Eventually, Edward was captured and brought back to Ithaca to stand trial. But the prosecution faced a significant problem. Despite extensive searches of Kaunga Lake, no bodies had been found. Edward chose to represent himself in court, confident that his superior intellect could outwit the legal system. His strategy was elegantly simple. Without physical evidence of death, how could they prove any crime had been committed? The jury, swayed by Edward's persuasive arguments and the absence of bodies, reached a compromise verdict. Unable to convict him of murder, they found him guilty of kidnapping his wife. In 1846, Edward was sentenced to 10 years in Auburn prison. Auburn prison became an unexpected sanctuary for Edward's intellectual development. Instead of breaking his spirit, incarceration gave him the time and focus to pursue his true passion, the study of language. Edward threw himself into philology, the scientific study of language development and structure. This wasn't just academic curiosity. Edward believed he had discovered revolutionary principles that would make him famous throughout the scholarly world. His research, which he planned to publish as The Great Secret in Philology, represented what he considered his greatest intellectual achievement. He was convinced he had uncovered fundamental truths about language evolution that had escaped the notice of established academics. Prison officials, recognizing Edward's exceptional abilities, granted him unusual privileges. He was allowed to teach other inmates Latin and Greek, conducting educational sessions in his own cell. The irony was striking. The same brilliant mind that had calculated his family's murders was now being celebrated for its scholarly contributions. But as Edward's release date approached, authorities delivered devastating news. The moment he was freed, new murder charges would be filed against him. Edward immediately claimed double jeopardy protection, launching a sophisticated legal battle from his prison cell. The district attorney, recognizing the strength of Edward's argument regarding his wife's murder, made a strategic decision. He dropped all charges related to Harriet's death, but immediately filed new ones for baby Priscilla's murder. Since the infant had never been included in the original kidnapping charges, no double jeopardy protections applied. In 1858, Edward was convicted of murdering his daughter and sentenced to death, but during his years in prison, he had cultivated relationships with key people in the legal system, including Albert Jarvis, the undersheriff's son, whom Edward had tutored in classical languages. Whether through the Jarvis's help or his own cunning, Edward managed to escape before his execution. He fled westward on foot, surviving on stolen food and wild nuts, ultimately losing 2 toes to frostbite. The brilliant scholar had become a desperate fugitive, reduced to scavenging in the wilderness like an animal. When Edward reached Melville, Pennsylvania, he reinvented himself once again. Using the alias James Nelson, he impressed local inventor A.B. Richmond with his vast knowledge of subjects ranging from geology to biology to forensic science. Richmond was so taken with Edward's intellect that he offered him a business partnership. In Melville, Edward achieved everything he had always dreamed of being, a respected intellectual whose abilities were properly valued and appreciated. But this success led to an even greater opportunity. Jefferson College in southwestern Pennsylvania offered Edward a professorship, the academic position he had craved his entire life. This was his chance to become the celebrated scholar he knew he deserved to be, to finally gain recognition for his linguistic theories. But the past has a way of catching up with people, even those as clever as Edward Rulloff. Albert Jarvis, the undersheriff's son who had helped Edward escape, contacted him with a demand. Jarvis and his mother were now destitute, and they threatened to expose Edward's true identity unless he provided them with money. Here was Edward on the verge of achieving everything he had worked toward, and his criminal past was about to destroy it all. Rather than finding legal ways to help the Jarvises or risking exposure by ignoring them, Edward made a choice that revealed his true nature. He turned to robbery. Edward robbed a jewelry store intending to give the money to the Jarvises, but he was caught and sent back to New York to face justice. What happened next defied all logic. Despite being a convicted murderer, escaped fugitive, and now a robber, Edward successfully appealed his conviction and was released when authorities decided not to prosecute him further. Free once again, Edward reunited with Albert Jarvis in New York City, where they survived as professional burglars. In 1861, Edward was arrested again and sentenced to prison, where he met his next criminal partner, William Dexter. Even behind bars, Edward continued his linguistic research. In 1869, he learned about the first convention of the American Philological Association and submitted a paper titled Method in the Formation of Language, using the pseudonym Professor Uri Loriot. He offered to sell his research for $500,000. Edward was certain his discoveries would revolutionize the field of linguistics, but the academic community rejected his theories outright. No one even bid on his manuscript. This rejection crushed Edward's last hope for legitimate success and recognition. The academic world had turned its back on him completely. There was nothing left now but crime. With his scholarly dreams permanently shattered, Edward devoted himself entirely to criminal enterprises. Along with Albert Jarvis and William Dexter, he planned what he believed would be the perfect robbery. Their target was a dry goods store in Binghamton, New York. 2 clerks, Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs, lived above the shop. Edward's plan was methodical and precise. They would use chloroform to keep the clerks unconscious while they cleaned out the store below. Edward approached this crime with the same analytical mind he had once applied to linguistic research. He studied the building, observed the clerks' routines, and developed what he was convinced was a foolproof strategy. But Edward's greatest strength had become his greatest weakness. Years of success had bred dangerous overconfidence. He believed his intelligence made him virtually invincible. It was just after midnight on the 17th of August, 1870, when everything went wrong. As the 3 men crept through the darkened store, Albert Jarvis accidentally stumbled over something, creating enough noise to wake the sleeping clerks. Frederick Merrick grabbed a gun from under his pillow and tried to shoot Edward, but the weapon misfired. He then hurled a wooden stool at the fleeing burglars. Chaos erupted as Gilbert Burrows seized William Dexter and began beating him viciously. When Merrick joined the assault on Dexter, Edward and Jarvis rushed to help their partner. Edward fired a warning shot into the air and Burrows stopped fighting, but Merrick threw himself at Jarvis with renewed fury. Edward fired another warning shot, but Merrick wouldn't stop. In that moment, Edward made a decision that would seal his fate. He aimed his gun directly at Frederick Merrick's head and pulled the trigger. Merrick died instantly. This wasn't like Edward's previous murders, committed in private with opportunities for cover-ups. Frederick Merrick had died during an armed robbery in front of a witness with no possibility of hiding the crime. In their panicked escape, the three criminals missed the boat that was supposed to carry them across the Chenango River. Instead, they tried to swim the treacherous waters. Jarvis and Dexter, exhausted from the fight and weighed down by their clothes, began to drown. Edward made it across, but his partners didn't. Their bodies were found the next morning. Some speculated that Edward had deliberately let them drown to prevent their capture and testimony. The manhunt for Frederick Merrick's killer was swift and systematic. Gilbert Burrows had provided police with detailed descriptions of the robbers, and patrols were organized throughout Binghamton. Edward, despite years of experience evading capture, made a fatal error the next morning. When police officers approached him at the railroad station and asked for identification, he panicked and ran. He fled across the train tracks to a nearby farm where he hid in an outhouse, a pathetically undignified end to his flight from justice. When captured, Edward gave false names, but his lies fooled no one. The most damning moment came when he was brought before the bodies of Jarvis and Dexter. Edward claimed he didn't know either man, but this denial was immediately exposed when Judge Ransom Balcom recognized him. "You are Edward H. Rulloff," the judge declared. "You murdered your wife and child in Lansing in 1845. Then he issued a prophetic warning. This man understands his rights better than you do and will defend them to the last." Edward's trial began on the 4th of January, 1871, and immediately became a media sensation. Crowds of 2,000 people gathered daily to witness the proceedings. Once again, Edward chose to represent himself, confident his superior legal knowledge could save him. The trial sparked fierce debate about genius and criminality. Some prominent figures, including newspaper editor Horace Glay, argued that someone with Edward's intellectual gifts was too valuable to execute, regardless of his crimes. Mark Twain wrote a scathing, satirical response, offering to find someone else to confess to Edward's crimes and be executed in his place. This devastating critique exposed the absurdity of claims that intelligence could excuse murder. On the 3rd of March, 1871, Edward was found guilty and sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, he finally confessed to murdering his wife, Harriet, describing the crime in chilling detail. But he never admitted to killing baby Priscilla, taking that secret to his grave. On May 18th, 1871, Edward Howard Rulloff was executed before a crowd of nearly 2,000 spectators. His final words, whether they were, "Hurry it up, I want to be in hell in time for dinner," or simply, "I can't stand still," captured the arrogant defiance that had defined his entire life. After his death, Edward's brain was removed and taken to Cornell University, where it was declared the largest human brain on record at that time. Professor Burt Wilder preserved it in a jar, where it remains to this day, a haunting reminder of how brilliance can be perverted into evil. Edward Rulloff's story challenges everything we think we know about intelligence and morality. His massive brain, larger than Einstein's, larger than virtually any genius in history, had housed a mind capable of revolutionary discoveries in linguistics and language. Instead, that same brilliant organ had planned and executed multiple murders with cold, calculating precision. The case of Edward Rulloff raises questions that still haunt us today. What is the relationship between intelligence and morality? Can exceptional gifts excuse terrible crimes? How do we reconcile the capacity for both genius and evil within the same mind? Edward's preserved brain, still sitting in its jar at Cornell University more than 150 years after his death, serves as a chilling reminder that intelligence without conscience doesn't create scholars or benefactors. it creates monsters. The mystery of what happened to baby Priscilla remains unsolved to this day. Did Edward really kill her, or did he send her away under a false identity? We may never know the truth. What we do know is that Edward Howard Rulloff, the man with one of the largest brains in human history, used that extraordinary gift not to better humanity, but to destroy it. His story stands as a stark warning that brilliance without empathy is perhaps the most dangerous combination of all. The genius killer's legacy lives on, not in the scholarly recognition he craved, but in the haunting reminder that the greatest minds can harbor the darkest secrets. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who look exactly like the people we're supposed to trust and admire. And somewhere in a laboratory at Cornell University, Edward Rulloff's massive brain continues to pose the same disturbing question it has for over a century. If intelligence doesn't guarantee goodness, what does? Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating and disturbing criminal minds. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the dark corners of human nature. Until next time, remember that intelligence without empathy can be humanity's most dangerous combination.